There is a man who built his empire on blood, fear, and the broken bodies of people who had nothing left to lose. He has never once felt guilt. He has never once looked back. But one winter night, in a forgotten diner at the edge of the city, he sees a woman with a shattered arm and a bruised jaw. And something inside him, something he buried so deep he forgot it existed, refuses to stay quiet. What he is about to discover will not just shake his empire. It will destroy everything he thought he knew about himself. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The diner had no name worth remembering. It sat at the far edge of the industrial district where the road curved away from the city proper and the streetlights thinned out to almost nothing, and the few that remained buzzed with that sick yellow light that made everything look like evidence. The sign above the door had lost 2 of its letters years ago, and nobody had bothered to fix it. The parking lot was cracked asphalt and dead weeds, and the kind of silence that settled over places the world had quietly decided to forget. Ronan Voss had been coming here for 3 years. He came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, always at 2 in the morning, always alone, always in a black car that he parked 2 blocks away and walked from so that none of his people would know where he went. In his world, habits were vulnerabilities. Routines were invitations. A man in his position did not have the luxury of predictability, except here, in this one place, at this 1 hour, because the diner was the only location in the entire city where nobody knew his face. He was 41 years old. He had been running the Voss organization for 11 of those years, inheriting it at 30 from a man named Gerald Hatch, who had made the mistake of believing that loyalty was permanent. Gerald had been wrong about that. Gerald had been wrong about a lot of things. Ronan had spent the years since building something that Gerald never could have imagined. Not just an organization, but a machine. A living infrastructure of fear and money and carefully applied violence that stretched from the port districts all the way up through the financial corridors of the city's north end. He employed over 300 people directly. Another 400 worked adjacent operations, loan offices, security firms, 2 legitimate restaurant chains that moved money when it needed moving. He owned city councilmen. He owned 2 judges. He owned a deputy commissioner of police who called himself an honest man at his daughter's soccer games every Saturday morning and took an envelope from Ronan's people every second Friday without blinking. None of them knew he came here. None of them knew he sat in the 3rd booth from the back, the one with the torn vinyl seat that had been repaired with electrical tape, and drank bad coffee and ate eggs that were always slightly overcooked, and for 2 hours pretended that he was nobody. He didn't fully understand why he kept coming back. He tried to analyze it once, the way he analyzed everything, the same cold, systematic dissection he applied to supply chains and territorial disputes, and the occasional problem that required a more permanent solution. He'd concluded that it was the noise, not noise in the loud sense. The diner was quiet at 2 in the morning, but it had the particular ambient texture of a place that was still alive, the hiss of the flat-top grill, the distant sound of a radio in the kitchen, the occasional clatter of a mug being set down too hard. It sounded like the world was still functioning, like ordinary things still existed. Or maybe it was the waitress. He wasn't prepared to fully examine that one. Her name was Mila Hart. He knew that from the tag she wore on her uniform, the small rectangular plastic tag with the name printed in faded black letters that she always wore slightly crooked, as if she put it on in a hurry and never checked the mirror. She was somewhere in her early 30s, though there were nights when exhaustion carved her face in ways that made her look older. She had dark hair that she kept pulled back while she worked, and eyes that were a quiet kind of brown that saw more than they let on, and hands that moved with a practiced economy, never wasted motion, never unnecessary gesture. The hands of someone who had been working hard for a very long time. She never treated him like anyone important. That was the thing he kept coming back to, if he was being honest. Everyone in his life treated him with a specific quality of attention, careful, deferential, perpetually aware of what he was and what he could do. Even the people who hated him, even the rivals and the enemies, and the men who sat across tables from him with carefully neutral expressions while they calculated their odds. Even they treated him with a kind of heightened focus that amounted to fear by another name. Mila brought him coffee and said, "The eggs are decent tonight. Cook's in a good mood." She refilled his cup without being asked. Once, when he'd been in 3 nights in a row because the situation was running long and he needed somewhere to think, she'd set a piece of apple pie in front of him without a word and said, "On the house. You look like you haven't eaten anything real in days." He hadn't known what to do with that. He'd eaten the pie. That had been 8 months ago, and he still thought about it sometimes, which irritated him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Tonight he pushed through the diner door at 2:07, later than usual because there'd been a situation at the port that required his personal attention. A container that wasn't where it was supposed to be, and a harbor master who'd developed an alarming new interest in transparency. That had been resolved. Most things were resolved when Ronan Voss decided they needed to be. He settled into his booth, shrugged off his coat, and picked up the laminated menu he'd never once needed to read. He heard her before he saw her. Not her voice. She wasn't speaking. It was the sound of movement, the specific way someone moves when they are trying very hard not to show that they are in pain. A careful, compensating gait. The kind of walk that takes concentration. He'd heard it before, in men who were hiding injuries they didn't want acknowledged, and some animal part of his brain registered it before his conscious mind caught up. He looked up. Mila was coming around the counter with a coffee pot in her left hand. Her right arm was encased in a heavy plaster cast that ran from just below her elbow to the base of her fingers, white and industrial and stark against her uniform. She was moving it carefully, keeping it slightly elevated, the way you moved a broken thing you were still learning to navigate. And along her jaw, partially obscured by the overhead lighting but unmistakable to someone who had seen enough of them to know what they looked like. A bruise. Deep purple at the center, yellow-green at the edges. 3, maybe 4 days old. She came to his booth and set down the coffee cup and poured without meeting his eyes. "New injury," he said. She glanced up. Something moved across her face. Not quite surprise, more like the particular resignation of someone who had been hoping a thing wouldn't be noticed and has just watched that hope expire. "It's nothing," she said. "Stupid accident. Slipped on some ice outside the back entrance." He looked at the cast. He looked at the bruise. He said nothing for a moment. "Ice doesn't usually catch you across the jaw." "I hit the railing on the way down." She was already turning away. "You want eggs tonight?" "Mila." She stopped. Her back was still to him. "Look at me." She turned slowly. Her face was composed in the way that faces are composed when composure requires active effort. She met his eyes directly, which most people didn't do, and held them there with the particular steadiness of someone who has decided they will not flinch even if it costs them something. "Who hurt you?" he said. Not a question. "It was an accident," she said. "Ice, railing, I just told you." "I know what you told me." The silence between them had a texture. She was still holding the coffee pot. He could see the slight strain in her left arm from the weight of it, and he could see the way she was holding her right arm with that constant, careful tension, protecting it without thinking about it, the way you protected a thing that had been broken and hadn't finished hurting yet. "Eggs," she said finally. "You want eggs?" He let her go. He sat with his coffee and watched her move behind the counter, and he thought about the way she'd held his gaze, and he thought about the bruise, and he made a decision that he would later recognize as the first step toward the most significant upheaval of his life. He was going to find out who did it. It took him 4 days. He didn't use his usual people for the initial inquiry. That would have drawn attention and created questions he wasn't ready to answer. Instead, he used a man named Corvin, who ran a private information service out of a second-floor office above a dry cleaner, and who had a talent for finding threads and following them without making noise. Corvin was one of approximately 7 people in the city who knew Ronan's face and had not yet made an error in judgment. He was paid accordingly. Ronan gave him Mila's name and the diner's address, and nothing else. Corvin came back in 96 hours with a folder. Ronan read it in his car, parked outside his building, in the dark, because he needed to be alone when he went through it. He was not certain why he needed this, only that he did. Mila Hart, 33 years old. Born in a small town 4 hours north of the city. Moved here at 19, no family on record. High school diploma, no further education. Had worked at the diner for 6 years, putting in 60 to 70 hours a week between the regular shifts and the additional early morning hours she picked up when the overnight girl called out, which was apparently often. Her apartment was a studio on the 4th floor of a building in the Kessler neighborhood, which was the kind of neighborhood that existed in the space between transitional and deteriorating and had been stuck there for about a decade. Rent was $740 a month. Her average take-home after taxes, based on the hours logged, was roughly $1,100. She was not saving money. She was not spending it on herself either. Her apartment, based on the building's assessor photos, contained the minimum furniture for functional human habitation and nothing more. Ronan turned to the next page. Corvin had found the loan. $52,000 taken out 14 months ago through a company called Meridian Financial Solutions, which operated out of a narrow office on Callahan Street and offered short-term loans to people who couldn't qualify for bank financing, at interest rates that Ronan recognized immediately because Meridian Financial Solutions was one of 7 front operations he owned in the Kessler district. It processed money for him. It also, apparently, preyed on the neighborhood's residents with structured loan agreements designed to ensure the borrower could never fully exit the debt. Escalating interest tiers, penalty fees stacked on penalty fees, collection protocols that escalated to physical enforcement at the 60-day delinquency mark. He had known this in the abstract. He had approved the operational model 3 years ago when Garrett Hess, his lieutenant for the district operations, had presented it as a revenue stream. He had looked at the numbers, seen the margins, and approved it. He had not thought particularly hard about the individual human beings on the other end of those loans. He was thinking about one of them now. He turned to the next page and found what Corvin had flagged as the anomaly. Mila Hart had not spent the money on herself. Every transaction Corvin had been able to trace led to the same destination, Cedarfield Hospice and Memory Care Facility, located on the west side of the city, in a neighborhood that was 1 tax bracket above Kessler and charged accordingly for the privilege. Cedarfield was a private facility. It was not cheap. The monthly cost for a resident in the memory care ward was between $4,800 and $6,200 depending on the level of care required. Mila had been covering the care costs for a resident there, a woman named Evelyn Hale. Corvin's file included a brief notation. Evelyn Hale, 77 years old, admitted to Cedarfield's memory care ward 22 months ago. Advanced dementia. No listed next of kin on the facility intake forms. The only emergency contact on file was Mila Hart, listed as family friend. Ronan closed the folder. He sat in the dark for a long time. He was not a man who experienced emotions as clean, identifiable states. What he felt was more like the seismic awareness of something massive shifting underground. A pressure change. A structural adjustment. Nothing he could point to yet, but something he could feel in the parts of him that had not been fully deadened by the last 2 decades. He opened the folder again and read it from the beginning. He went to Cedarfield himself. He didn't announce himself or use his real name. He had a secondary identity he used for situations that required discretion. Not a full alias, just a name and a cover story plausible enough to survive a surface check. He told the woman at the front desk that he was doing an insurance audit and needed to verify some resident records, and he gave her a card from a firm that existed on paper and in a suite of offices that could receive mail. And she looked at the card and at his face and made the calculation that most people made, that he was exactly what he appeared to be, which was a man who was used to being given what he asked for. And she showed him the file. Evelyn Hale. He sat with the file in a small conference room off the main lobby, while the administrator hovered near the door with the particular nervous energy of someone who wasn't sure they were doing the right thing, but wasn't sure how to stop. He read through the intake documentation and the care notes and the medical assessments with the same focused attention he brought to any operational document. The dementia had progressed significantly over the 2 years she'd been at Cedarfield. In the early notes, she had periods of clarity. She could hold conversations. She recognized faces. By the most recent entries, the lucid periods had become rare and brief. The cognitive decline was documented in the flat, clinical language of medical record keeping, which somehow made it worse rather than better. The reduction of a human life to a series of assessments, each one measuring how much less remained than the time before. One of the care notes from 8 months ago had been written by the ward's primary nurse and included an observation that wasn't strictly clinical. Patient is frequently distressed in the evenings, responds positively to visits from Emsh Hart, who comes 3 to 4 times per week and consistently brings patients' preferred music on a portable speaker. Patient recognition of visitor is inconsistent, but visitors' presence has measurable calming effect. He set the file down. 3 to 4 times per week. From Kessler to the west side, that was a bus ride or a walk, depending on the hour and the schedule, and he knew from the folder that Mila didn't own a car. He thought about the hours she worked. He thought about what was left after 60 or 70 hours behind a counter, the residue of energy in a human body when it had given most of what it had, and he thought about her making that trip 3 to 4 times a week regardless. He asked the administrator before he left whether the woman in room 14 had any family. The administrator said, very carefully, that there was a listed next of kin. He drove away. He pulled over 2 blocks from the facility and sat in a supermarket parking lot for 20 minutes doing nothing. He was not a man who usually needed 20 minutes to process information. He saw it happen on a Wednesday morning. He'd had Corvin track Mila's general schedule. Not in detail, not a surveillance operation, just enough to understand her movements. And he knew she made her hospice visits in the early mornings before her afternoon shifts began, which meant she was crossing the city at the worst hours, the ones where the bus ran on reduced service and the walk from the nearest stop was 15 minutes in good weather. It was not good weather. It was February, and the city had settled into the particular mean cold that arrived in the second month of the year and stayed long past its welcome. Not dramatic cold, not the kind that made the news, but a wet, grinding cold that came with a constant low wind off the lake and made every exposed surface feel hostile. The sky was the color of old pewter, and it had been raining since before dawn, the kind of rain that couldn't decide if it wanted to be sleet and kept switching back and forth just to be unpleasant about it. He was parked on Marsden Street, half a block down from the bus stop, when Mila got off the number 12 at 7:40 in the morning. She was wearing a coat that was too thin for the weather, and she had a canvas bag over her left shoulder. The portable speaker, probably, and whatever else she brought, and her right arm in its cast was tucked close to her body against the cold. She walked with her head slightly down and her jaw set, and she moved like someone who had long since stopped expecting conditions to be anything other than what they were. He watched her turn the corner toward Cedarfield. Then he saw the 2 men. He recognized them before they'd taken 3 steps in her direction. He recognized them the way you recognize things that belong to you, not because he knew their faces specifically, though he thought he might know the shorter one from a briefing 6 months ago, but because he recognized the posture, the specific quality of movement that belonged to men doing collection work. Unhurried, purposeful, the kind of walk that said they already knew how this was going to go. They caught up with her at the mouth of the alley between Marsden and Cedarfield's rear service entrance, which was a quiet stretch at this hour. No foot traffic, no witnesses. He watched the shorter one step in front of her and say something. He watched Mila stop. He couldn't hear the words from where he was parked, but he could read the body language. She'd gone very still, the stillness of someone who had been here before and was trying to calculate the safest exit. The taller one said something and reached for her bag. Ronan was out of the car. He covered the half block in a pace that was not quite running. Running drew attention, and the discipline of 2 decades of operational work didn't abandon itself just because something was making his blood move fast. And he was in the alley before either man had registered movement behind them. "Step back," he said. Both men turned. The shorter one, Delvey, he remembered now, the name coming up from somewhere, a third-tier collector out of the Kessler operation, looked at him with the flat professional appraisal of someone sizing up an obstacle. Then the recognition hit. It moved across Delvey's face in phases, like weather arriving. The initial assessment, the second look, the recalibration, and then the very specific blanching that came when you realized you were standing in an alley having just put your hands on a woman in front of the man who signed your operational authorization. "Mr. Voss," Delvey said. His voice had gone careful. "I said step back." They stepped back. Mila had turned. She was looking at Ronan with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize. Not relief, not exactly, or not just that. Something more complicated. Recognition, yes, but also a new wariness, because she was smart enough to understand that the man who had just walked out of the dark to stop 2 collectors was not doing so because he was a passing stranger. "You know him," she said. It wasn't a question. "Get to the facility," Ronan said. "I'll find you when you're done." She looked at him for a moment. She looked at the 2 men. She made a calculation that he could see happening in real time behind her eyes. "Okay," she said. She walked past him. He listened to her footsteps fade. He turned back to the two men. "Tell me exactly what she owes," he said. "Tell me what the original loan was for, what the current balance is with interest and penalties, and tell me who authorized the physical collection protocol." Delvey told him. Ronan listened without expression. The amount, the interest structure, the escalation schedule, the fact that someone in Garrett Hess's operation had approved the injury to Mila's arm 6 weeks ago as a first-tier compliance enforcement, which was the language they used when they meant breaking someone's bones to communicate sincerity. He stood in the alley in the February rain and listened to all of it. "Go back to Kessler," he said when Delvey finished. "Tell Hess I'll speak to him this evening. Don't contact her again. Don't go near her building. Don't send anyone else. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "Yes, sir." "If I find out anyone from this operation approached her between now and when I've spoken to Hess, I will hold you personally accountable for that decision. Do you understand what that means?" Delvey understood. They left. Ronan stood alone in the alley for a moment. The rain had found the back of his collar and was working its way down. He didn't move to fix it. He was working through something, sorting through the operational and the personal in a way they didn't usually intersect, and it was taking more effort than it should have. He had known what Meridian Financial Solutions did. He had approved the model. He had looked at the revenue figures and nodded and moved on to the next item on the agenda. Somewhere in the mechanism he had built and signed off on, someone had made a decision to break the arm of a woman who spent her every free hour caring for an abandoned old woman in a memory ward. He had not given that order. He had built the system that gave the order. He was still standing in the alley when Mila came back 40 minutes later, cutting back through the service corridor toward the bus stop. She stopped when she saw him. "You waited," she said. "I said I would." She looked at him differently than she looked at him in the diner. In the diner, he was a regular, a night owl, a quiet man who tipped well and didn't cause trouble. Here she was looking at him the way you looked at something you had always seen clearly, but had never quite understood the scale of. "Who are you?" she said. "You already know." "I want to hear you say it." He looked at her in the rain. Her coat was soaked through. She had her canvas bag clutched against her side, protecting the speaker inside it, the speaker she'd brought to play music for a woman who might not even know she was there. "My name is Ronan Voss," he said. "I own the loan operation those men were collecting for. I own the debt they were threatening you over, and I'm the reason your arm got broken." The silence after that was very quiet. "Then why did you stop them?" she said. It was a fair question. He turned it over carefully before he answered. "Because I needed to see what this operation was doing up close, and I didn't like what I saw. It wasn't the complete truth, but it wasn't a lie." "Is the debt real?" she said. "No." "What does that mean?" "It means it's gone. I erased it this morning. There are no collection agents, no balance, no one coming after you. It's done." She looked at him for a long time. The rain fell between them. "Why?" she said. "You don't know me." "No," he said. "I don't." She absorbed that. He watched her work through it. The skepticism, the calculation, the particular ingrained caution of someone who had learned not to accept things from people who had the power to take them back. "There's no such thing as free in your world," she said. "I'm not asking for anything." "Everyone asks for something." "Then call this an anomaly," he said. "I'm not going to explain it to you better than that right now." She looked at him one more time. Then she nodded once, short and unreadable, and turned and walked to the bus stop without looking back. He watched her go. He went back to his car and sat in it for a long time. That evening, he summoned Garrett Hess. The meeting was in the lower level of a building Ronan owned in the commercial district, a space that served as a secondary operations center when he needed somewhere off the main grid. Hess arrived at 7 with 2 of his own men, which told Ronan something about Hess's current state of awareness. A man who brought backup to a private meeting with his superior was either protecting himself or expecting to need protection, and neither option spoke well of his judgment. Hess was 44 and had been running the Kessler district operations for 4 years. He was competent in the way that middle management was competent, reliable at execution, weak at judgment, very good at finding ways to increase revenue in the short term without asking whether the long-term costs were worth it. Ronan had known this about him and had kept him in place because the district ran smoothly on paper. He was now revising his assessment of what smoothly meant. The Meridian operation, Ronan said. Hess said, "What about it?" "Walk me through the collection escalation policy." Hess walked him through it. He used operational language and didn't flinch, which meant he either didn't know Ronan had witnessed this morning's confrontation or didn't understand why it mattered, and Ronan wasn't sure which was worse. The woman on Marsden, Mila Hart, the broken arm. Hess's expression shifted slightly, a micro-adjustment, nothing an untrained observer would catch. She was 62 days delinquent, standard first tier. Who authorized the physical enforcement? I reviewed and approved the escalation schedule for... I'm asking who gave the order for her specifically. Hess paused. I did. Ronan nodded. He spent the next 40 minutes going through every detail of the Meridian operations collection practices with the careful, systematic attention he gave to things that mattered. By the end of it, he had a complete picture. Hess had built a machine that operated by finding vulnerable people, offering them money they desperately needed, and then systematically grinding them with fees and penalties until they couldn't exit the debt through any legal means. When they couldn't pay, the machine broke them, first financially, then physically if necessary, because the suffering of the people in the machine was invisible to everyone running it and therefore didn't exist. Ronan had approved this. He had read the operational summary 3 years ago and approved it. He sat with that knowledge and felt the weight of it in a way he rarely allowed himself to feel the weight of anything. Effective immediately, he said, the Meridian operation is suspended. All collection activity stops tonight. All outstanding loans in the Kessler district are discharged. You will have Corvin pull the full portfolio, and I will review every file personally. Hess stared at him. That's 42 active accounts, Hess said. We're looking at... I know what we're looking at. Ronan, that revenue stream is... I know what the revenue stream is. He kept his voice level. I built it. I know exactly what it's worth, and I know exactly what it costs. I'm telling you, it's done. Hess was quiet for a moment. He was doing arithmetic. Ronan could see it happening. The calculation of what this meant for the district numbers, for his own standing, for the implicit balance of power in a conversation where he had just been told that a significant piece of his operation was being dismantled. And the Hart account specifically, Hess said, discharged, done. If anyone from any operation touches her again for any reason, I will hold you directly responsible. Are we clear? We're clear. Good. Your men can wait outside. You and I have more to discuss. Hess sent his men out. The discussion that followed was not comfortable for Hess. When it was over, Ronan sat alone in the space and thought about a woman in a too-thin coat carrying a speaker through the February rain to visit someone who might not know she was there. And he thought about the name in the hospice file, Evelyn Hale. And he thought about the persistent, nagging sense that he had seen that name somewhere before in a context that he couldn't quite locate. He would locate it. It would take 2 more days. And when it arrived, it would not arrive quietly.
But somehow...
He found her at the diner on Thursday night, his regular time. She was behind the counter when he came in. She looked up when the door opened, and something in her expression shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone watching would have necessarily caught, but enough. She poured his coffee before he'd settled into the booth, which she'd always done, but she came to the table instead of leaving the cup at the counter, which she didn't always do. She stood by the table with the coffee, and for a moment neither of them spoke. You came back, she said. I usually do. I wasn't sure you would, after this morning. He looked at her. The cast was still there. The bruise had faded a little at the edges. She was standing without the careful, compensating posture. The pain was settling then, moving from acute to chronic, which was its own kind of progress. I wanted to ask you something, he said. Okay. Evelyn Hale. How did you know her? Something changed in her face. Not fear. It wasn't fear. It was more like the expression of someone who has been carrying something in private for a long time and has just heard that thing named out loud. She pulled out the seat across from him. She sat down. She set the coffee pot on the table. You looked into it, she said. I looked into the loan. She was in the file. Mila looked at her hands for a moment. When she looked up, her expression had settled into something that was mostly honest. I met her 4 years ago, she said. She was living in her car, 2 blocks from this diner, in the alley behind the hardware store. It was November. She wasn't doing well. I started bringing her food, then I started sitting with her. She paused. She had these periods where she was completely lucid, and then periods where she was somewhere else entirely. I didn't know what was wrong with her at first. I just knew she was alone. You got her into Cedarfield. It took a while. The social services process was... She shook her head. There was a waiting list, and the memory care ward wasn't covered by the public rate. By the time a bed opened up, I'd already been managing her care for a year. I couldn't put her somewhere worse. She looked at him steadily. So I borrowed the money. From my operation. I didn't know it was yours. I just knew they'd give it to me without credit history. Something moved in her voice that she controlled before it became visible. I knew the rate was bad. I knew I couldn't really afford it. But she needed to be somewhere safe, and I was the only person who... She stopped. Who what? He said. Who was going to do anything about it? She said. I was the only person who was going to do anything. Ronan looked at her across the table. He thought about the name in the file. Evelyn Hale. He thought about why it had been pulling at him for 2 days, working its way up through layers of compressed memory like something that had been submerged trying to surface. In the facility records, he said carefully, there was no next of kin listed. There wasn't any that I could find. She never talked about family except she mentioned a son sometimes, in the lucid periods. She never said his name, she just said she'd left him when he was young. She'd say it like she was confessing something, like it was the thing she carried. Mila paused. Most of the time, she doesn't remember saying it. Ronan said nothing. You look like something just hit you, Mila said. He was very still. What's her maiden name? He said. His voice came out even. He was controlling it the way he controlled everything, with the applied force of will that had gotten him through 30 years of situations where control was the only thing standing between him and collapse. Mila frowned. I never asked. She just said Evelyn, sometimes Evie. Her birthday. Do you know it? I know the facility has it in the records. I could... She stopped. She was reading his face. Ronan, what is this? I need to see the full intake file from Cedarfield, he said. The original documentation. The forms she filled out when she was still coherent enough to fill out forms. Why? Because I need to verify something. What something? He looked at her across the table. He thought about the shape of the next few hours and what they would mean for every hour that came after. My mother's name was Evelyn, he said. She left when I was 8 years old. I don't know if she's alive. I've never looked. He paused. I've never let myself look. Mila stared at him. The diner hummed around them. The grill, the radio in the kitchen, the soft buzz of the overhead lights. Outside the windows, the city went about its business, indifferent and continuous. The son she mentioned, Mila said slowly. The one she left. Ronan said nothing. Mila's hand moved on the table, a small, involuntary shift, like she was reaching for something and caught herself. I have her intake documentation at my apartment, she said quietly. I kept copies of everything, in case something happened and I needed to advocate for her. When can you get it? Now, she said. I can go get it now. She stood up. She picked up the coffee pot. She looked at him with an expression that he couldn't decode, something layered and complex and not easily compressed into a single word. I'll be back in 20 minutes, she said. He watched her disappear into the back. He sat alone in the booth and put both hands flat on the table and breathed, which was the only option available to him right now. The only action that was possible in this specific moment before he knew what the next moment contained. 23 years since he had allowed himself to think about her. 23 years of building walls and burying the thing that lived behind them, the specific 8-year-old damage that had shaped everything he became afterward. And he had spent every one of those years deciding that the burial was permanent and the walls were adequate and the thing behind them was finished. Mila came back in 18 minutes. She was holding a manila folder. She set it on the table in front of him. He opened it. He looked at the name on the intake form, the date of birth, the photograph that had been taken when she was admitted 2 years ago, when the dementia was already progressing, but her face was still recognizable as a face he had known. His mother, alive. In a memory ward 4 miles from where he was sitting, being cared for by a waitress who had borrowed $50,000 from his own operation and had her arm broken by his own collectors so that a woman nobody else remembered could have a warm bed and music in the evenings. He closed the folder. He set it carefully on the table. He sat there for a moment and did not perform any particular reaction because the reaction that was occurring inside him was not one he was able to perform. It was too large and too old and too tangled with everything he had built himself on top of. All the concrete and rebar and deliberate forgetting that had turned him from an abandoned 8-year-old in a house that suddenly had no woman in it into the thing he was now. He looked up at Mila. She was watching him. "I have to go," he said. "I know," she said. "I have to go tonight." "I know." She paused. "Room 14. She sleeps early, but the night nurse lets people in for family. If you say you're family." She held his gaze. "Are you going to be okay?" He stood up. He picked up the folder. "No," he said. It was the most honest thing he had said to anyone in years. He walked out of the diner into the cold night, and behind him, inside the warm buzzing light, Mila Hart stood alone by the table and watched him go. And she understood that something had just cracked open that could not be closed again. And she wasn't sure yet whether that was a good thing or a terrible one. But she was certain, the way she was certain about very few things, that it was the truth. He drove toward the west side. He drove toward room 14. He drove toward the woman who had left him when he was 8 years old and whom he had spent 30 years deciding he would never look for. And the particular quality of the silence in the car around him was the silence of a man who has just discovered that the story he told himself about his own life was not the complete story. The city slid past the windows, lit and indifferent. He kept driving. The night nurse at Cedarfield was a heavy-set woman named Paulette, who had the particular weary authority of someone who had spent 20 years managing other people's worst moments at 3 in the morning. She looked at Ronan when he came through the side entrance, the one Mila had told him about, the one that stayed unlocked until midnight for family visitors. And she looked at the folder under his arm and at the quality of stillness in his face, which was the stillness of something under enormous pressure that had not yet decided which direction to break. "Visiting hours ended at 8, she said. "I know. You family?" He thought about the intake form, the photograph, the date of birth that matched the date of birth on a document he hadn't looked at in 30 years, but still knew the way you knew the shape of an old scar. "Yes," he said. Paulette looked at him for a moment longer. She had the evaluating gaze of someone who had seen enough people in crisis to recognize the specific texture of it, the controlled exterior, the thing moving underneath. "Room 14, she said. "She's probably asleep. Don't wake her if she is, and don't—" She paused. "If she gets confused, don't argue with her about what's real. Just go with wherever she is. It's kinder." "Okay," he said. "You need anything? I'm at the station." He walked down the corridor. The memory care ward had its own particular atmosphere, quieter than the rest of the building, with a kind of padded, deliberate calm that was partly architectural and partly the result of everything being softened and rounded and stripped of sharp edges. The lighting was low and warm. The carpet was thick enough to swallow footsteps. There were photographs on the walls, landscapes, not portraits, nothing that might confuse a resident about faces. And the whole wing smelled faintly of something clean and neutral that wasn't quite antiseptic and wasn't quite floral. He found room 14. The door was slightly open. He pushed it the rest of the way and stood in the doorway. She was asleep. She was in the bed nearest the window, on her side, facing away from him. The room was small and functional. A hospital bed adjusted to look less clinical, a single chair, a low dresser with a photograph on it that he couldn't see from the doorway, a portable speaker on the windowsill that he recognized because Mila had described it. Outside the window, the city made its distant noise, muted through the glass. He came into the room. He stood at the foot of the bed. He looked at her. She was smaller than he remembered. He understood intellectually that this was always true, that the adults of your childhood are always larger in memory than they are in fact. But understanding it intellectually and experiencing it were different things. She was thin in the way that people became thin when their bodies were winding down, the specific thinness that had less to do with diet and more to do with a gradual withdrawal. Her hair was white. Her face, in profile against the pillow, still held the structural architecture he remembered, the line of the jaw, the shape of the brow, but it was overlaid with decades he hadn't witnessed, events and years, and whatever had happened to her in the time between leaving and here that he would never fully know. He sat in the chair. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He just sat. He sat there for a long time and did something he hadn't done in longer than he could accurately measure, which was simply to feel the full weight of a thing without immediately converting it into a problem to be solved. There was grief in it. There was anger, old and deep, the specific anger of an 8-year-old that had never properly resolved, only been cemented over and built upon. There was something else underneath both of those that he didn't have a clean name for, something closer to sorrow, or to exhaustion, or to the particular ache of arriving somewhere 30 years after you needed to be there. She shifted in her sleep. She turned slightly, and for a moment her face was more visible, not awake, not aware, but present in profile. And he looked at her and thought about the morning he had come downstairs and she was gone. No note, no warning. The kitchen exactly as it always was. The coffee pot on the counter, the dish rack with last night's plates, every ordinary object in place except her. He had waited, the way children waited, with the absolute certainty that there was an explanation coming, that this was temporary, that the ordinary logic of things would reassert itself. He had waited for 3 days before the neighbor, Mrs. Ackerman, had called his father and the machinery of family crisis had begun to move around him. He had never stopped waiting in some small compartmentalized place. He had just built so much on top of that place that he'd almost convinced himself it wasn't there. He stood up. He looked at her one more time. He left the room. He walked back down the corridor and past Paulette's station and out through the side door into the February air. And he stood outside the building with his hands in his coat pockets and his breath making clouds in the cold. And he thought with complete clarity, this is not over. Whatever shape the rest of this takes, it is not over. He drove back to his office building. He made 3 calls. By morning, the machinery had begun to move. Dump. Garrett Hess came to the main office at 9 the following morning, which was earlier than Ronan had asked for, and therefore told Ronan something about Hess's current level of anxiety. Early arrivals were either eagerness or damage control, and nothing about Hess's recent performance suggested eagerness. The main office was on the 14th floor of a building Ronan owned outright in the financial district. A legitimate holding company on paper, real estate and property management, and the building was real, and the property management was real, and the revenues it generated were real, and none of that contradicted what else moved through its structures. The office itself was spare in the way that genuinely powerful spaces were spare. No art on the walls, no personal items on the desk, nothing that gave away anything about the man who occupied it. The view was the city, which was enough. Hess came in with 2 folders under his arm, and the careful expression of a man who had spent the previous night deciding how to present information he knew was going to land badly. "Sit down," Ronan said. Hess sat. "Tell me about the broader collection portfolio." Hess opened the first folder. He laid out the numbers. The full Meridian operation across all 7 Kessler fronts, the outstanding loan portfolio, the delinquency rates, the collection activity log. He presented it in the flat operational register of a man reporting facts, which was sensible, but Ronan noticed the places where the flatness cost him effort, the slight additional neutrality when he got to the enforcement logs, the micropause before the injury statistics. 64 accounts in active collection. Of those, 22 had been subject to what the logs called physical compliance interventions in the previous 12 months. 11 of those had resulted in documented injuries. Ronan saw this in the cold language of the reports, the clinical descriptions of what had been done to people who had borrowed money because they had no other option. He read every entry. Hess sat across the desk and waited. "Who else knows the operation is suspended?" Ronan said when he finished. "The Kessler captains. Word will have spread to the district crews by this morning." And the reaction. Hess was quiet for a moment. "Mixed. Be specific." "The crews understand the order. No one's pushing back at the ground level because they understand what pushing back looks like." He paused. "The captains are... There's concern about the revenue impact. The Meridian operation was contributing about 14% of the Kessler district's monthly net. I know what it was contributing. Some of them feel that the suspension sets a precedent, that if one revenue stream gets shut down because..." Hess stopped. "Because what?" Ronan said. Hess met his eyes. because of a personal connection to one account. There's a concern that it signals inconsistency, that decisions are being made on another pause. On non-operational grounds. Ronan looked at him. Who said that? It's a general sentiment. It came from somewhere specific. Who said it? Hess looked at the desk. Callum Reeve raised it, in the captain's briefing this morning. Callum Reeve ran the East District, the port operations, the warehouse network, 3 front businesses along the commercial corridor. He was 51 years old and had been in the organization longer than Ronan had been running it. He was competent and experienced and had a specific quality of contained ambition that Ronan had always been aware of and had always judged manageable. He was now reassessing that judgment. "Get Reeve in here this afternoon," Ronan said. "He has a—" "This afternoon." Hess nodded. He reached for his folders. "Leave those," Ronan said. Hess left them. After he was gone, Ronan stood at the window and looked at the city and thought about the phrase non-operational grounds. He turned it over. He examined it from multiple angles. He understood what it meant. In the architecture of the organization, decisions were supposed to be made on the basis of money and power and strategic positioning, and decisions made on any other basis were either weakness or unpredictability, and both of those were exploitable. He was not confused about what he was doing. He was suspending the Meridian operation because it had been breaking people who had nothing, including a woman who had been using the money to care for his mother, and that was the complete explanation. There was nothing operationally strategic about it. There was nothing that could be dressed up in the language of long-term risk management, not honestly. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. He was aware that this was a sentence that had not previously featured in his decision-making. He was also aware that it did not change the sentence. He picked up the phone and made a call to Corvin. "I need everything on Callum Reeve," he said. "Full current picture. I want it by 3. Well, Mila came in for her shift at noon. He knew this because he had driven past the diner at 11:30, not stopping, just registering that the lights were on and there were 2 cars in the lot and the sign was doing its usual half-lit attempt at readability. He drove past and kept going and told himself it was not surveillance, that he was not monitoring the movements of a woman he'd known as a late-night regular for 3 years, that he was simply— He didn't finish the sentence. He drove back to the office and worked through the Meridian portfolio files for 2 hours. At 2 in the afternoon, Callum Reeve arrived. Reeve was a broad man, not tall but substantial, with the physical presence of someone who had come up through the operational side of the work rather than the administrative, and who still carried that history in the way he occupied space. His face had the closed, weathered quality of a man who was careful about what he let the outside of him communicate. He had gray at his temples and clean clothes, and the specific groomed professionalism of someone who understood that presentation was its own kind of power in rooms like this one. He sat across from Ronan without being asked to and set his hands flat on the desk in a gesture that walked the line between comfortable and deliberate. "You wanted to see me," he said. "You raised a concern this morning," Ronan said, in the captain's briefing, about the Meridian suspension. Reeve's expression didn't shift. "I raised a revenue concern. That's within my remit. You raised it in the context of personal connections affecting operational decisions. That's a different kind of concern." A brief pause. "I was characterizing what others were saying. Garrett tells me you were the one saying it." Another pause, longer. Reeve looked at him with the evaluating stillness of a man reassessing his position on a board. "The organization needs to know that decisions are being made on stable grounds," he said. "When a significant revenue operation gets shut down overnight without strategic justification, people look for explanations. If the explanation is personal, that creates uncertainty. Uncertainty creates—" "I know what uncertainty creates," Ronan said. "I built this organization on the understanding that certainty is its own kind of currency. Don't lecture me on instability." Reeve held his gaze. "Then give me something to tell the captains that isn't personal." "The Meridian operation was generating liability," Ronan said. "Physical enforcement at that scale, with that frequency, against civilian debtors who have no organizational connection. That's exposure. It's not a sustainable model when the regulatory environment is moving the way it's moving. I made a call to cut it before it cut us." He paused. "That's the operational framing. Use it." Reeve sat with this for a moment. He was working through it. Ronan could see the machinery running behind his eyes. The assessment of whether this explanation was true, whether it was sufficient, whether it served his interest to accept it or push further. And the heart account specifically, Reeves said. The discharge. Covered under the full portfolio suspension. There's no specific account. You were seen in this Kessler district Wednesday morning, early, near the Meridian collection route. Ronan looked at him. I was where I needed to be, he said. You were seen stopping a collection action, personally. I was conducting a field assessment of the operation. His voice stayed level. And what I assessed was that it needed to stop, which it has.
Reeve looked at him for a long moment. The quality of the silence between them had shifted. It was the silence of a conversation where one man has tested a boundary and found it still standing, but noted the precise location of it for future reference. Understood, Reeve said. He stood. Is there anything else? One thing, Ronan said. The conversation you had this morning with the captains, I need you to understand that raising questions about the basis of my decisions in that forum is not something I'm going to allow to become a pattern. If you have concerns, they come to me directly, not to the group. Are we clear on that? Reeve's jaw shifted slightly. We're clear. Good, that's all. Reeve left. Ronan sat at the desk and looked at the city through the window and felt the particular chill of a thing that had just become visible. Reeve had come in here measuring something. The measurements would continue. They always did, in organizations built on power. The constant recalibration of where the center was and whether it was steady and whether this was the moment to test it more directly. He had 3 phone calls to make. He made them. He went to the diner at 2 in the morning. He hadn't decided to go. He'd been working at his desk at 1:30, working through the Reeves situation and the broader implications of the Meridian dismantlement and a situation developing in the Port District that required strategic attention, and then at some point he had put on his coat and walked to his car without making a conscious decision and had driven to the Industrial District on the route he had driven twice a week for 3 years. Mila was behind the counter. She looked up when he came in. She did not look surprised. He sat in the third booth from the back. She brought coffee. She didn't sit down immediately. There was a table at the other end that needed clearing, and she cleared it, moving with the particular tired efficiency of someone 9 hours into a shift with no particular end in sight. When she came back, she refilled his cup without asking and stood there for a moment. How was she? Mila said. He looked up. Last night, Mila said. How was she? He thought about the room, the small figure in the bed, the white hair and the face that still held the architecture of something he had memorized before he was old enough to understand that memorization was a survival mechanism. Asleep, he said. I didn't wake her. Mila nodded. She pulled out the seat across from him and sat down. She did this carefully, with the awareness of an employee sitting with a customer in a place where that wasn't the usual arrangement, but she did it anyway with the directness that was one of the consistent things about her. Are you going to go back? She said. I don't know yet. You should. She said it plainly, without decoration. Whatever she did, whatever it was. She doesn't have a lot of time left and there's not going to be another window. You don't know what she did. No, she said. I don't. But I know what's in that room and I know what it costs to not go. She paused. I've watched a lot of people die in this city in the last few years, Ronan. People in that ward. People who waited for someone to come and used everything they had left on hoping. She's not doing that. She doesn't have the cognitive. She doesn't know to wait anymore. But you do. He looked at her across the table. There was something in her face that was not pity, which was the thing he would not have been able to tolerate. It was something else, a blunt, unsentimental honesty that came from someone who had spent years in proximity to loss and had been shaped by it into something clear-eyed rather than soft. Why did you do it? He said. The loan? All of it. The money, the visits. She was a stranger living in her car. Most people walk past. Mila was quiet for a moment. She looked at the table. She reminded me of my mother, she said finally, the way she'd go somewhere else in her head and then come back. My mother had something similar, not dementia, but she'd just leave mentally, check out, and then she'd come back and she'd be all the way there, completely present, and it was... She stopped. It felt like something I already knew how to do, staying, being there for the return. Your mother.
She died when I was 26. She said it without extra weight, the way you said things you had long since finished being destroyed by. But I learned how to stay with someone who kept leaving. And then I met Evelyn, and she was leaving too, just in a different direction, and She looked up. I just kept showing up. I didn't have a plan. I wasn't heroic about it. I just kept showing up because stopping felt worse. He sat with that. Outside, the street was empty and quiet. The grill hissed softly in the kitchen. Somewhere in the back, a radio played something low and indistinct. "The men I had collecting from you," he said, before I stopped it. "Yeah. They were going to come back. They were on a 60-day schedule. If I hadn't—" "I know," she said. "Your arm. I know." He looked at his coffee. He looked at his hands on the table, the hands he used to make decisions that resulted in other people's pain, the hands that had signed off 3 years ago on the operational model that had sent those men to her building and had stood there while they broke her arm over a debt she'd taken on to care for a woman she'd found in an alley. "I'm sorry," he said. The two words sat between them with the specific weight of words that cost something to say. Mila looked at him. Something in her expression moved. Not forgiveness, which would have been too easy, but something more complicated. An acknowledgement. A recognition that the words were real. "Okay," she said. Not absolution, not erasure, just okay. "I heard that. I'm accounting for it." He breathed. The door opened. 2 men came in. Ronan saw them before the door had fully swung, registered them with the automatic attention his brain applied to entrances, exits, and moving bodies in his field of vision. They were not here for the eggs. They were dressed too well for this hour in this neighborhood, and they moved with the contained deliberateness of men who had come to say something and wanted an audience for it. He recognized the taller one, Marcus Sell, Callum Reeves' chief lieutenant, a meticulous, cold-eyed operator who had worked the East District for 7 years and who communicated in every line of his body the consciousness of working for someone who considered himself the next step up in a particular direction. Sell scanned the diner. His eyes found Ronan. He did not look surprised. He crossed to the booth and stood at the end of it, not sitting, the standing deliberate. It was a power position, staying upright while the person you were addressing was seated, and the fact that Sella had chosen it said everything about what kind of conversation this was going to be. "Mr. Voss," Sella said. "Marcus." Ronan's voice was flat. "This isn't the place." "Mr. Reeve thought it might be easier to reach you here." "Mr. Reeve knows my office number." He thought a more informal setting might be. Sally glanced at Mila, a brief and pointed glance that was not threatening but communicated the awareness of her presence as a variable. More conducive. Mila was very still. She had the quality of stillness that someone developed when they had learned that stillness was sometimes the safest response to a room that had changed temperature without warning. Ronan looked at Sel. "Whatever Reeve wants to say to me, he can say to me directly," Ronan said. "In my office, tomorrow morning. You can tell him I said that." Sel reached into his jacket. Ronan's body read the gesture before his mind did, muscle and training assembling in the half-second before conscious thought could intervene. But what Sel produced was an envelope, white and standard, which he set on the table with a precise, deliberate motion. "Mr. Reeve asked me to deliver this," Sel said. Ronan looked at the envelope. He didn't touch it. "What's in it?" he said. "Accounts," Sel said. But figures, a proposal." He paused. "He thought you might want to review it privately before your conversation tomorrow." He turned and walked back to the door. The second man followed. They went out into the night. The diner was quiet again. Ronan looked at the envelope on the table. Mila said, very quietly, "What just happened?" He picked up the envelope. He opened it. Inside were 3 pages of figures, the Kessler District revenue projections, the Meridian Operations contribution broken down by quarter, and on the final page, a single paragraph that was framed as a proposal, but read, with any knowledge of how these conversations worked, as something closer to an ultimatum. The paragraph said, "In the careful language of men who chose words with the awareness that words could be evidence, that certain stakeholders in the East and Kessler districts had concerns about strategic direction, that these concerns were shared among a significant portion of the operational leadership,
and that a meeting had been proposed for Sunday evening to discuss the path forward for the organization's revenue operations. A meeting, without Ronan's knowledge, without his authorization, scheduled for Sunday. He set the pages down on the table. He sat there and breathed, steady and slow, the way he breathed when things required clarity, and clarity required the body to slow down and cooperate. Reeve had just told him, in the most formal language available to men in their position, that a faction was forming, that Sunday was a deadline, that the question of who made decisions in this organization and on what basis was no longer a settled matter. He had been in the organization for 11 years. He had run it for 11 years. He had inherited it from a man who hadn't been careful enough, and he had built it into something that man couldn't have imagined, and he had done so by being, at every critical moment, the person in the room who was most willing to do what was necessary. He had never faced an internal challenge of this scope. He had also never, in 11 years, made a decision that could accurately be described as non-operational. Until this week. He looked at Mila across the table. She was watching him with the clear, steady brown eyes that saw more than they let on, and she was holding very still in the way she had been still since Sela walked in. And she looked at him and said nothing, because she understood enough of what she'd just witnessed to know that what he needed right now was not words from her. He folded the pages. He put them in his inside pocket. He thought about Evelyn in room 14. He thought about the way the organization would read what he had done this week. The suspension, the discharge, the personal appearance at a collection confrontation in the Kessler district. He thought about Sunday. He thought about what Sunday meant and what the options were and what each option would cost. He looked at Mila. After Sunday, he said, things are going to be different. Different how? She said. He picked up his coffee. He finished it. He set the cup down. I don't know yet, he said, but they'll be different. He pulled his coat on. Go home after your shift, he said. Not the usual route. Take the long way through the Haverford blocks. Don't open the door for anyone tonight. She looked at him steadily. Am I in danger? He thought about the envelope. About Sela standing in a diner at 2 a.m. to deliver a message that was also a message about knowing where Ronan Voss went when he thought nobody was paying attention. I don't know, he said. Which was the honest answer. Which was the answer that told her everything she needed to know. He left money on the table and walked out into the cold. Behind him, Mila Hart sat alone in the booth with the coffee pot and the empty cups and the knowledge that the quiet late-night regularity of the last 3 years had just ended, and she didn't know yet what was going to replace it, only that whatever came next was already in motion and the only direction available was forward. Ronan walked to his car. He took out his phone. He called the one man in the organization he trusted completely, a man named Dex, who had been with him since before Gerald Hatch, who asked no unnecessary questions and gave no unnecessary advice. Sunday, Ronan said when Dex picked up. I need you to find out who's going to be in that room. Already working on it, Dex said. Which meant Dex had been expecting this call, which meant the fracture was wider than Ronan had estimated. He sat in the car and looked at the diner through the windshield, the half-lit sign, the warm yellow light in the windows, the ordinary, unremarkable face of the one place in the city where he had ever felt like something other than what he was. He started the engine. He drove into the dark, and somewhere across the city, in a room on the 14th floor of a building Callum Reeve did not own but intended to, men were gathering and counting and deciding that this Sunday was the moment to find out what happened when the man at the top of the machine made the machine feel uncertain about itself. They were about to find out what happened. It was not going to go the way they expected. Dex called back at 6 a.m. Ronan was already awake. He hadn't slept in any meaningful sense. He'd been horizontal for 3 hours on the couch in his office, which was not sleep but was the closest approximation available when the mind refused to fully disengage. He was at his desk with coffee when the phone rang, and he picked it up on the first ring. 7 names, Dex said. Ronan waited. Dex read them. 5 of the 7 were predictable. Kessler district captains who ran operations adjacent to Meridian, men whose revenue projections were directly impacted by the suspension, and who had the organizational motive to align with whoever was promising restoration. He had anticipated them. He had already begun drafting the strategic responses in his head, the combination of pressure and incentive that would peel them away from Reeve before Sunday, the specific vulnerabilities of each that could be applied with surgical precision.
The sixth name was Garrett Hess.
That stung slightly, though it shouldn't have surprised him. Hess had delivered the Meridian files under orders, had sat in the chair and absorbed the dismantlement of his operation with the flat professional expression of a man banking his reaction for later use. The alignment with Reeve was the later use. Ronan noted it and moved on. The seventh name stopped him cold. "Say that again," he said. Dex said it again. "Vincent Corau."
Ronan sat with the name for a moment. Vincent Corau was 53 years old and had been in the organization since before Ronan had inherited it from Gerald Hatch. He ran the North District, the financial corridor operations, the legitimate business network, the banking relationships that made the money clean and mobile. He was not a man of dramatic gestures or loud ambitions. He was, in the taxonomy of the organization, a stabilizer, the kind of man whose value was precisely that he made things predictable. Ronan had trusted him the way you trusted infrastructure, without thinking about it, without checking. "How certain?" Ronan said. "Certain enough that I'm telling you before 6 in the morning," Dex said. Ronan set down his coffee. "Where did you get it?" "His assistant, Elena Marsh. She's been with him for 9 years. She called my secondary number last night at 11. She said Corau met with Reeve on Thursday, the day after you suspended Meridian. She said she transcribed the meeting notes because Corau asked her to, and then she read what she'd transcribed and understood what it was." "What did the notes say?" "That Reeve's proposal for Sunday isn't a negotiation. It's a formal motion to transition operational authority. Reeve is positioning himself as a stabilizing force after what he's calling an erratic decision pattern in the current leadership. Corau is backing it. The other 5 are supporting votes." Ronan said nothing. "There's more," Dex said. "Tell me." "Corau's been in contact with someone outside the organization, someone in the Galvin network." The Galvin network was the nearest thing to a rival power structure in this city.
Not a traditional organization, but a loose confederation of independent operators who had been consolidating quietly in the port and manufacturing districts for the past 18 months. Ronan had been aware of them. He had assessed them as a medium-term concern, not an immediate threat. He had planned to address them after the current quarter's structural adjustments were complete. He was now revising that timeline dramatically. "Corau reached out to Galvin's people," Dex said, 3 weeks ago. "Before the Meridian suspension, before any of this. He's been building an exit for himself, a guarantee that if the transition goes through and the organization restructures, his North District operations get absorbed into the Galvin network under his continued management." Ronan looked at the window. The city was gray and early and indifferent. "He's been planning this for 3 weeks, Ronan said, at minimum. Which meant it had nothing to do with Meridian. Meridian had been the occasion, not the cause. The cause was something older and more calculated. A man who had decided the organization's trajectory under Ronan's leadership wasn't the trajectory he wanted, and had begun constructing an alternative before any visible trigger existed. Which meant Ronan had missed it. He did not miss things. It was the foundational principle of how he operated, Tuts. The constant, comprehensive attention to the room, to the organization, to the people inside it. He had built everything on the assumption that he saw clearly. He had looked at Corau for 11 years and seen infrastructure and seen nothing else. And Corau had used that exact blindness. "Get me Corau's location," Ronan said. "I want him in the office in 2 hours." "He won't come voluntarily if he thinks you know." "He doesn't know what I know. Get me his location and have 2 men available. Quietly." Dex paused. "And Reeve?" "Reeve waits until I've talked to Corau. I want to know the full shape of it before I move on the bigger piece." "Okay." "Dex." Ronan paused. "The 6 names that weren't on your list, the other captains. I need confirmation they're still solid before noon." "I'll have it." He hung up. He sat at the desk and stared at nothing for a moment. Not emptiness, not vacancy, but the specific internal stillness of a man running calculations on multiple tracks simultaneously. The betrayal, the Galvin connection, the timeline. The Sunday meeting, which was no longer a negotiation but a coup attempt with outside backing, which changed everything about what Sunday could and couldn't be. He thought about Mila. Sel had known where to find him. That meant Reeve had known about the diner, And if Reeve had known, the question was how long he'd known and what else he'd done with that knowledge. The diner was an exposure. Mila was an exposure, not because she was anything other than what she was, but because she was a place where Ronan went when he thought he was unobserved, and in the world he operated in, unobserved places were leverage. He picked up the phone and called a man named Torres, who ran a discreet personal security operation and owed Ronan a significant favor. "I need someone on a woman," he said. He gave Torres the address of Mila's building in Kessler. "Protective detail. Starts now. She doesn't know about it and doesn't need to." Torres said he'd have someone there within the hour. Ronan put the phone down and went to make more coffee. Corral arrived at the office at 8:15. Dex had collected him from his apartment building in the North District with 2 men and a car, and the collection had been professional and quiet. Not aggressive, just the application of presence in a way that made the invitation non-optional. Corral was a compact, precise man who wore his suits the way he ran his operations, without excess, nothing unnecessary. He came through the office door with his coat over his arm and his face arranged in the careful, neutral expression that Ronan recognized now as the expression of a man who had been maintaining a deception and was now calculating how much of it could still be sustained. Ronan was at his desk. He didn't stand. Corral sat across from him without being asked, which was his way. The small territorial assertions of a man who was meticulous about never appearing subordinate unless absolutely required. "You wanted to see me," Corral said. "Thursday," Ronan said. "What did you and Reeve discuss?" A pause. Brief but real. The micro-hesitation of a man whose prepared script has just been punctured at the opening line. "Quarterly projections," Corral said. "The revenue impact of the Meridian suspension across the connected operations." "You met at his building, not here. Not a neutral location. His building. He called the meeting. It was convenient for Vincent." Ronan's voice stayed level. "I have the meeting notes." The silence that followed was a different quality of silence. Corral's face didn't collapse. He was too experienced for that. What happened was more subtle. A settling, a slight relaxation of the muscles around his eyes, as if a sustained effort had been quietly concluded. The effort of pretending. "Elena," he said. Not a question. "It doesn't matter how." Corral looked at him steadily. He set his coat across his knee and smoothed it once, a habitual gesture, something to do with the hands. "How long?" Ronan said. "The Galvin conversations?" "All of it." Corral was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had shifted, still controlled, but with the specific quality of a man who had decided that if the fiction was finished, there was no point in the half measures. "I've had concerns about the organization's direction for approximately 2 years," he said. "The Meridian situation accelerated the timeline, but it wasn't the origin. You've been making decisions with decreasing consultation. The organizational structure has become," he paused, selecting the word with visible care, "personalized, in ways that create fragility." "Fragility," Ronan said. "When one man's judgment is the only operational constant, and that judgment begins to say what you're saying." Corral looked at him directly. "You stopped a collection action personally, in an alley, for a woman you've been meeting in secret for 3 years. Then you dismantled an entire revenue operation overnight. Then you visited a hospice patient that nobody on the operational side knew existed." He paused. "I've run the North District for 9 years. I've watched you make decisions. You don't make decisions like that. And when a man in your position starts making decisions he can't explain operationally, the people around him need to make their own decisions about what that means." Ronan looked at him. "The Galvin Network," he said. Corral's jaw tightened slightly. "A contingency. You went outside the organization, to a competing power structure. You opened negotiations with people who would benefit directly from this organization's destabilization." Ronan kept his voice completely flat. "That's not a contingency, Vincent. That's a signal. You told Galvin's people that the organization was available for disruption. You gave them a timeline and an internal contact. Everything that happens to this organization's operations from the moment you made that call is a consequence of what you told them." Corral said nothing. "You've been with this organization for 13 years, Ronan said. You built the North District banking relationships from nothing, I trusted your judgment on the financial architecture for a decade. He paused. And you went to Galvin. Something moved in Korao's face. Not guilt, exactly, but the particular expression of a man who had made a calculation and still believed the calculation was correct and was not going to apologize for the arithmetic. I was protecting my position, Korao said. You were burning the building to protect your office inside it. I was ensuring that if the leadership transition happened— There is no leadership transition, Ronan said. There is a group of men meeting on Sunday who believe there's a leadership transition. There isn't one. I want to make sure you're clear on that before this conversation goes further. Korao looked at him. For the first time since sitting down, something like uncertainty moved through his expression. The Sunday meeting, he said carefully. I know who's in the room. I know what the motion says. I know about the Galvin backing, which means Reeve knows about it too, which means Reeve has been in contact with them as well, or you've told him. And either way, this has gone a significant distance outside the organization's walls. Ronan leaned forward slightly. What I need to know now, Vincent, is how far outside. What did you tell Galvin about our port operations? Korao was very still. The port operations, Ronan said again. I gave them a general overview of the shipping corridor arrangements, Korao said. How general? A pause. Enough to demonstrate the value of a potential merger. Ronan stared at him. The port operations were the deepest part of the organization's infrastructure. The arrangements with harbor personnel, the container manifests, the connection points with the international supply chains that moved through the city. That information, in the hands of a competing network with the operational capacity to use it, was not leverage. It was a loaded weapon pointed at the organization's foundation. When? Ronan said. 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago. He repeated it to hear the shape of it. And in 3 weeks, Galvin's people have had time to map the operations, identify the vulnerabilities, and position themselves to move against specific points if Sunday doesn't go the way Reeve expects. Korao said nothing, which was its own answer. Ronan stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to Korao and looked at the city below and breathed. And for a moment the room was completely silent except for the distant murmur of the city going about its business 12 floors down, unaware and indifferent. He had built this organization over 11 years. He had tightened every bolt and mapped every vulnerability and constructed the internal architecture with the specific intention of making it resistant to exactly this kind of fracture. He had done it well. He had been good at it. And somewhere in the depth of that competence, he had missed a man who sat across from him every week for 9 years, who had attended every significant operational meeting, who had helped design the financial systems that kept everything running, and who had decided, quietly, methodically, without a flicker of visible disloyalty, that he was better served by the organization's failure than its continuation. He turned back. Take him downstairs, he said to Dex, who was standing near the door. Put him somewhere comfortable. He's not going anywhere until Monday. Korao stood. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his coat. You understand this doesn't change Sunday, Korao said. I know, Ronan said. Reeve will proceed regardless. The votes are committed. Galvin is positioned. Taking me out of the room doesn't change the arithmetic. I know that too. Korao looked at him one more time. The expression on his face was complicated. The complex of a man who respects an opponent and regrets the necessity but doesn't regret the decision. He gave a short nod, which was about as close to acknowledgement as the situation permitted, and went with Dex. The door closed. Ronan stood alone. He had approximately 54 hours until Sunday's meeting. He had a faction of 6 captains with committed votes, an outside backing and operational intelligence that had been leaking for 3 weeks. He had an organization whose financial architecture had just been compromised at the structural level by the man he'd trusted most to maintain it. And he stopped here, made himself stop, made himself look at this thing directly. He had done none of this for operational reasons. He had walked into this situation with his eyes open, knowing that the meridian suspension was visible and the personal appearance in Kessler was visible, and the trajectory of his decisions was readable to men who watched him closely, and he had done it anyway. Not strategically, not tactically. Because it was the right thing to do, and because an 8-year-old's wound had cracked open in a diner in the industrial district, and because a woman in a too-thin coat had borrowed $50,000 to keep a stranger alive. He did not regret it. He was sitting with that fact and the weight of it when his phone rang. It was Torres. "The woman," Torres said. "Mila Hart." Ronan's body went very still. "What?" he said. "My man got to the building at 7:40. He set up across the street. At 8:05, 2 men entered the building. They went to the 4th floor. They were in the building for approximately 9 minutes. Ronan was already moving coat in hand toward the door. "Where is she?" he said. "She's still in the building. She didn't leave with them. But my man said she came to the window at 8:17 and he said she looked like someone who'd just been told something that scared her." "Is she hurt?" "Not physically. Not that he could see." "Keep your man on the building. Don't let her leave without someone on her. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He was in the elevator before he finished the sentence. In the car, running red lights in the thin morning traffic, he thought about what 9 minutes in Mila's apartment looked like. Not violence. If they'd wanted violence, it would have taken less time and Torres's man would have seen different things when she came to the window. Not a collection visit because that operation was dead. A message, then. The question was whose message and what it contained, and the answer to that question would tell him exactly how far Sunday had already arrived. He pulled up outside her building at 8:41. He took the stairs. He knocked on the door of apartment 4C. A long pause, then, "Who is it?" "Ronan." Another pause, shorter. The lock turned. She opened the door, and he looked at her, and Torres's man had been right. She looked like someone who had been told something that scared her, but Mila's version of scared was not what scared looked like on most people. It was more compressed, more internal, a tightening rather than an unraveling. Her eyes were sharp and fully awake, and her arms were crossed in the specific posture of someone holding themselves together with deliberate effort. He came in. The apartment was small and spare. The minimum furniture he'd expected from the assessor photos. A table, 2 chairs, a narrow kitchen, a window that looked onto the street. On the table there was a manila envelope already opened, the contents partially visible. He looked at the envelope. He looked at her. "They came from Reeve," she said. "They said that. They wanted me to know the name." "What's in the envelope?" She looked at it for a moment as if she were deciding whether to tell him or show him. She picked it up and held it out. He took it. Inside were photographs, 8 of them. The first 3 were surveillance images, taken at distance, grainy but clear enough, of Ronan entering and leaving the diner on 3 separate dates. The next 2 were images of him in the alley on Wednesday morning, confronting Delvey's collection team. The 6th was an image of him sitting in the 3rd booth from the back, across the table from Mila, coffee cups between them. The 7th photograph stopped him. It was Cedarfield. The exterior of the facility, with a timestamp of Thursday night, 11:43, and a figure coming through the side entrance that was clearly him, coat, build, the particular way he moved that he could not mistake for anyone else. He looked at the 8th photograph for a long time. It was room 14, shot through the window from outside, the camera with a long lens and a steady hand. The image showed the interior of the room. The bed, the figure in it, small and white-haired and asleep. And in the chair beside the bed, captured in profile, a man sitting in the specific stillness of someone who is feeling something enormous and trying to contain it. Ronan, sitting beside his mother's bed. They had been watching him the entire time. Not just the diner, not just the alley. They had followed him to Cedarfield and they had photographed him inside through the window in the most private moment he had experienced in 20 years. He set the photographs on the table. "There was a note," Mila said. Her voice was controlled. "In the envelope." "What did it say?" She reached into the envelope and pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it without opening it, looking at him. "It says if you don't step back from the operational leadership by Sunday evening, they'll send these photographs, with a full explanation of the woman in room 14 and your connection to her, to every rival network in the city." She paused. "And it says the woman in room 14 will be moved from Cedarfield before Monday morning to an undisclosed private facility, and that her care will be, it says, contingent on your cooperation." The room was very quiet. He looked at the folded note in her hand. He looked at the photographs on the table. He looked at her face, the tightness of it, the specific expression of someone who has just understood that they have become a point of leverage in something that was never about them. "They know who she is to you," Mila said. "That she's your mother." Someone told them. He thought about Korau, about the 9 years of operational meetings and the carefully assembled North District files, and the man who had been in every significant conversation for a decade. "Yes," he said. "So they're threatening her?" "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "Can they do it? Move her." He thought about the operational capacity of what Reeve had assembled, the Galvin backing, the committed votes, the photographs, which meant surveillance at a scope and duration he hadn't detected. "They have the resources," he said. She absorbed this. The tightness in her face shifted slightly, not dissolving, but restructuring, the way a person's expression restructured when they had moved through the initial shock of a thing and arrived at the question of what to do about it. "Then you have to stop them before Sunday," she said. "Not negotiate with them, not wait for the meeting. Stop them before they can move her." He looked at her. "That means doing things that can't be undone," he said. She held his gaze without flinching. "I know what you are," she said. "I've known since that morning in the alley. I'm not asking you to be something different." She paused. "I'm asking you to protect her, whatever that requires." He looked at the photographs, at the image of himself in the chair beside the bed, captured without his knowledge in the one moment he had allowed himself to feel the full weight of 30 years of unresolved loss. They had taken that from him too. They had turned it into an instrument. He picked up his phone. He called Dex. "Sunday's moved up," he said. We're not waiting for the meeting. I want the warehouse on the waterfront secured by tonight. I want every man we can trust on standby by 8 p.m. And I want Reeves' location confirmed and monitored from this moment forward." Dex said, "How far are we going?" Ronan looked at Mila across the small apartment. She was watching him with those clear, steady eyes, the eyes that saw more than they let on, and she looked like exactly what she was. A woman who had borrowed $50,000 and had her arm broken and had kept going anyway, who had kept showing up because stopping felt worse. "As far as it takes," he said. He hung up. He looked at the photographs one more time. Then he picked them up and put them back in the envelope and put the envelope in his coat. "Pack a bag," he said to Mila. "You're not staying here tonight." She didn't argue. She went to the narrow closet and pulled out a bag and began moving through the apartment with the quiet efficiency of someone who had never had much and therefore knew exactly what mattered. And he watched her and thought about what was coming in the next 36 hours and understood with complete clarity that after it was finished, nothing, not the organization, not his position in it, not the carefully constructed life he had built on the foundation of an 8-year-old's wound, would look the same. He had spent 11 years being the most dangerous person in every room. Tonight, he was going to have to... He had spent 11 years being the most dangerous person in every room. Tonight, he was going to have to make sure that was still true. The warehouse sat at the far end of the waterfront district, where the commercial piers gave way to the decommissioned industrial stretch. A long block of corrugated steel and poured concrete that had processed fish and then machine parts and then nothing, and had stood empty for 4 years while Ronan paid the property taxes and kept the utilities minimally active, and told himself he was holding it for development. He had always known, at some level, that he was holding it for something else, for exactly this kind of night. Dex had it secured by 7:30. Ronan arrived at 8 with Torres and 4 men he trusted completely. Not the most, not the highest ranking, but the ones whose loyalty he had tested at actual cost. Men who had been given opportunities to betray him and hadn't. That was the only metric that mattered now. He had learned, in the last 48 hours, that the metric he had been using before, competence, tenure, institutional knowledge, was the metric of a man who had confused familiarity with reliability. He would not make that mistake again. The warehouse interior was cavernous and cold, the kind of cold that came from concrete and steel and no insulation and a wind off the water that found every gap in the structure. Portable lights had been set up along the central floor space, industrial floods that threw hard white light and deep shadows and made everything look like what it was, a place where outcomes got decided. Dex met him at the entrance. "Reeves' location," Ronan said. "His building in the East District. He's been there since 6. We have 2 men on the exterior." Dex paused. "He's not alone. Sel is with him. 3 others we've identified as East District operational staff. He's expecting Sunday. He's not expecting tonight. Good. Ronan looked at the warehouse floor. The 6 captains. 4 of them are reachable. 2, Marsh and Delacroix, are in Reeves' building. They arrived at 7, which meant the Sunday faction had partially consolidated already, pulling its key votes into Reeves' physical orbit as the timeline compressed. Reeve was a thorough man. He would have contingencies for Korao's disappearance. He would be running his own calculations about what Ronan knew and when he'd learned it and what his response window looked like. He would not have calculated tonight. The 4 reachable captains, Ronan said. I want them here. Not asked. Brought. Dex nodded. He made 2 calls. Ronan walked to the center of the warehouse floor and stood there in the hard white light and thought about the shape of the next few hours. He thought about the photographs, about room 14, about the note that said the woman in room 14 would be moved to an undisclosed facility, contingent on cooperation, and what that word, contingent, meant in the operational language of men who use soft words for hard intentions. He had placed a second security detail at Cedarfield at 6 that evening. Torres's people, discreet, positioned at both the front entrance and the side corridor. The facility director had been informed, not fully, not with context, just with the specific weight of Ronan's voice and the understanding that nobody entered room 14 without Ronan's authorization until further notice. The director had asked no questions. Some voices were like that. The 4 captains arrived between 8:20 and 8:50. They came separately, each with the specific expression of a man who had been collected rather than invited, and was running rapid internal calculations about what that meant. Ronan looked at each of them when they came in, looked at them the way he looked at everything important, with the total attention that had always been one of his primary instruments, and what he saw reassured him in the limited way that anything was reassuring tonight: fear. The clean, honest fear of men who had committed to a position and were now in a room with the man that position was directed against, and who were confronting the possibility that they had miscalculated the timing. Fear was workable. Fear meant they were still in the calculus, still capable of adjusting. The men who were dangerous were the ones who had moved beyond fear into commitment, and those men were in Reeves' building, not here. He stood in front of them. He didn't pace. He didn't gesture. He put his hands in his coat pockets and looked at them and spoke. You were in a meeting this morning, he said. A meeting I didn't authorize, at a location I didn't sanction, discussing a motion I wasn't informed of. I know the motion's language. I know the vote count. I know the external contacts. He paused. I also know that none of you originated this. Reeve originated it. Corral backed it. You were recruited, and recruitment looks different from instigation, and I'm making that distinction now because I want to be precise about what tonight means for each of you. He looked at them one at a time. The Meridian suspension stands, he said. The reasons for it are mine, and they're not open to operational review. What happens to the revenue gap is a legitimate organizational question, and I'm prepared to discuss it through the appropriate channels, which are the channels that have always existed and which Reeve chose not to use. He paused. What is not a legitimate organizational question is the motion that was drafted for Sunday. That motion is finished. The meeting it was scheduled for is finished, and the alliance with the Galvin network that Corral built and Reeve endorsed is a line that will have consequences for every man who knew about it and said nothing. One of them, a captain named Briggs, who ran a distribution operation in the Kessler-adjacent districts, said, "We didn't know about Galvin." Ronan looked at him. "When did you find out?" he said. Briggs glanced at the others. "This morning. Reeve mentioned it as he called it a contingency arrangement, a backup if the transition didn't go smoothly." "And your response?" Briggs was quiet. "Your response to learning that your organization's port intelligence had been shared with a competing network," Ronan said, "was to stay in the meeting." Briggs looked at the floor. "Here's what happens now," Ronan said. "You go back to your districts. You're available by phone. You don't contact Reeve and you don't contact anyone in the Sunday group. When this is resolved, we'll have a full captain's meeting and discuss the revenue restructuring properly." The men who were in that room for organizational concerns and not personal ambition will be fine. The men who were there because they saw an opportunity in the disruption will not be. He let that settle.
Do you understand the difference I'm describing? They
understood. He dismissed them. When they were gone, the warehouse was quiet, except for the water sounds outside, the creak of the pier structures, the distant engine of something moving in the harbor. And Ronan stood in the center of the floor and looked at Dex. "Reeve," he said. "When?" "Now." They took 2 cars. Ronan rode in the first with Dex and Torres. The other car had 3 men who moved through the city without lights in the way that people moved when they had been trained to be unremarkable in the dark. The East District was 20 minutes from the waterfront, through the late commercial stretches of the city where the restaurants were closing and the service workers were moving toward their cars, and nobody looked at black vehicles going north on the avenue with any particular attention. Ronan sat in the back and felt the city move past the windows. He was not afraid. He examined this fact with the same cold precision he examined everything and confirmed it. Not the absence of fear as a performance, not the suppression of it, but a genuine absence. He had been afraid in his life. He knew what it felt like. It wasn't this. What this felt like was something closer to clarity, the specific sharp focus that arrived when a long and complicated thing finally resolved itself to its essential components, and the path forward became the only visible option. His phone rang. Torres, in the front passenger seat, glanced back. Ronan looked at the screen. A number he didn't recognize. Not one of his people, not any contact in his phone. He answered. "I know you're moving tonight," said a voice. "Reeve." Ronan said nothing. "I respect it," Reeve said. "Genuinely. You're faster than I expected. Coro going quiet this morning told me you'd moved, but I thought you'd wait for Sunday to make it clean. You're not waiting." "No."
"Then let me save us both something." Reeve's voice was even, professional, the voice of a man conducting a negotiation from a position he believed was strong. "I don't want your blood on my hands, Ronan. That's not what this is. What I want is an organization that makes decisions that keep all of us viable. What you've been doing this week—" "Don't," Ronan said. "Pause. Don't explain my decisions back to me. Don't tell me what I've been doing. You've been watching me through windows and taking photographs in hospice rooms and building cases for a boardroom coup with money from a rival network. Don't talk to me about keeping things viable." A brief silence. "The woman in the facility," Reeve said. "Your mother. I want you to know that was Coral's intelligence, not mine. I didn't know who she was until he told me. That changes something for me personally. I'm not in the business of, where is she? She's still at Cedarfield. I haven't moved her. I won't, if we can—" "If I find out she's been touched," Ronan said, "there is no conversation. There is no version of tonight that ends with you in a building." The line was quiet for a moment. "I hear you," Reeves said. "Then hear this. Send your people home. You and I will talk. 1 room, no backup. If what you've built this week is genuinely about the organization's direction and not your own advancement, that conversation is available." Another pause. Longer. "And if I don't," Reeves said, "then tonight goes the way tonight goes." He ended the call. Dex looked back from the passenger seat. "He'll have heard the offer as weakness." "Maybe," Ronan said, "or he'll have heard it as a man who's certain enough of the outcome that he can afford to offer the alternative." He looked out the window. The East District lights were coming up. "Either way, we'll know in about 3 minutes." His phone buzzed. A text from Torres's man outside Reeves' building. Movement. East side exit. 2 men leaving. Then another 2. The building's losing bodies. Ronan showed Dex. "He's sending them home," Dex said. "Or repositioning them. Same difference if we're already at the door." The car stopped a block from Reeves' building. Ronan got out. The night air was cold and carried the industrial smell of the East District, diesel and metal, and the particular flatness of a neighborhood that worked night shifts and didn't apologize for it. He walked toward the building entrance with Dex beside him and Torres's men spreading to the periphery in the practiced geometry of men who had done this before. The lobby was unmanned. The elevator worked. They rode to the 3rd floor. The door to Reeves' office suite was open.
Reeve was standing at the window when Ronan came in. He was alone. He had his jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled, and he was standing with his arms loose at his sides in the posture of a man who had made a decision and was standing behind it. The office was functional and organized. Not spare like Ronan's, but ordered, the desk clear, the bookshelves arranged with the neatness of someone who thought of their environment as a projection of their competence. Sella was not in the room.
Ronan looked around the space once. Exits, sight lines, the desk, the door to the inner office, and then looked at Reeve. "Sit down," Ronan said. "I'd rather stand." "Sit down, Callum." Reeve sat. Ronan stood in front of the desk. He didn't sit. He looked at Reeve, and Reeve looked back at him. And between them was 11 years of the same organization, the same rooms, the same tables, and the same decisions. And all of it now compressed into this specific moment in this specific office where one of them was going to walk away with the question settled. "The Galvin contact," Ronan said. "Who initiated?" "Corral. I was brought in after the initial conversation. You endorsed it."
Reeve's jaw tightened. "I didn't stop it."
"That's the same thing."
"In our world, yes." He paused. "I know that. The port intelligence, the shipping corridor information. Do you understand what Galvin can do with that?" "I understand it creates exposure. It creates an attack vector," Ronan said, "against the entire port operation, against every arrangement we have with harbor personnel, against the international supply connections that took 7 years to build. If Galvin decides that Sunday doesn't go their way and they want to apply pressure or extract value another way, they have everything they need to dismantle the most profitable part of this organization from the outside." He looked at Reeve steadily. "You handed them a key to a door and told them the lock schedule." Reeve looked at the desk. Something in his face shifted. Not guilt in the soft sense, but the specific expression of a man confronting the full consequence of a calculation he'd made with incomplete information. "I thought Corral had given them general terms," he said. "He gave them operational specifics." Reeve was quiet. "Did you know about the photographs?" Ronan said. "Cedarfield. The room." A pause. "I knew surveillance had been extended to your movements outside the organization. I didn't specify locations." "But you saw the photographs." Reeve looked at him. "Yes." "And you authorized using them." The pause this time was the length of a decision being made in real time. "Yes," Reeve said. The word landed in the room and sat there. Ronan breathed, in and out. He felt his pulse in the side of his neck. Not racing, not spiking, just present. The steady mechanical fact of a living body that had a great deal still to do. "I want the Galvin contact information," he said. "Every communication, names, numbers, meeting records, everything Corral gave you and everything you added. I want it tonight." Reeve looked at him. "And in exchange?" "In exchange, this conversation ends here." "That's it. That's it." Reeve studied him. He was looking for the angle, for the part of the offer that was the real offer, the position underneath the position, because in their world nobody made clean trades, and the gap between what was said and what was meant was where the actual transaction happened. "You're serious," Reeve said. "I'm always serious." "You're willing to end it here, tonight, without—" "I'm willing to end the immediate situation here," Ronan said. "The Galvin exposure gets resolved separately. Your position in the organization gets reviewed separately. What ends here tonight is the motion, the Sunday meeting, and the use of personal information as operational leverage. Those 3 things end here and don't recur." Reeve sat with this. Outside the window, the East District went about its business. Lights and engines and the distant sound of a city that had no knowledge of the room it was providing backdrop for. "The files are on the laptop," Reeve said. "On the desk." Ronan looked at the laptop. "Unlock it," he said. Reeve reached across the desk and typed a code and turned the screen toward Ronan. Ronan looked at it. He looked at the folder structure, the Galvin communications, the surveillance files, the Sunday meeting documentation. He took out his phone and called Dex. "Come in," he said. "Bring the drive." Dex came in 2 minutes later with a portable drive. He copied the files without expression, with the professional efficiency of a man who had copied files under tense circumstances before and found nothing particularly remarkable about it. When it was done, he handed Ronan the drive and went back to the door. Ronan put the drive in his coat pocket. He looked at Reeve. "The Sunday meeting doesn't happen," he said. "Understood. You'll contact the captains tonight. You'll tell them the motion is withdrawn." Reeve's jaw shifted. "Tonight? Now, while I'm standing here?" A long moment. Then Reeve picked up his phone and made the call. Ronan listened to him deliver the message. Flat, professional, no explanation offered, to each of the remaining 4 captains. The calls took 11 minutes. When the last one was done, Reeve set the phone on the desk. "It's done," he said. "Marsh and Delacroix," Ronan said. "They were here tonight. They left an hour ago. Call them." Reeve called them. 2 more brief conversations. 2 more withdrawals. When it was finished, Ronan stood in the office for a moment and looked at the man across the desk. The man who had spent 3 weeks building a structure to remove him, who had authorized surveillance in a hospice room, who had put photographs of a sleeping old woman into an envelope and sent men to deliver them to a woman in a Kessler apartment as a demonstration of reach. And he felt, under the cold operational clarity, a low and persistent anger that was not going to resolve itself in this conversation. It would resolve itself later, in the form of consequences that were measured and specific and inevitable, but not tonight. Tonight had a different conclusion. "Go home," Ronan said. He walked out of the office. In the lobby, he stopped. Something was wrong. He felt it before he identified it. The particular atmospheric shift of a situation that had changed while he was looking somewhere else. The animal awareness of a variable that had moved. His phone rang. Torres. "Cedar Field," Torres said. His voice was tight. "My man at the side entrance just called in. Someone tried to get into the building 20 minutes ago. 2 men. Used fake staff credentials. My guy turned them away, but is she? She's in the room. She's fine. But Ronan, the attempt was 20 minutes ago. That was while you were in the building with Reeve." While he was in the building with Reeve, which meant it wasn't Reeve's order, which meant there was someone else. Someone who hadn't sent their people home. He looked at Dex. "Selle," he said. Dex's face went tight. Selle wasn't in the building when we arrived, because he wasn't standing down. He was already moving. Ronan was already walking toward the exit. Reeve made the calls. Selle didn't get the calls, or Selle got the call and decided it didn't apply to him. He pushed through the lobby door into the cold. "Cedarfield," he said. "Now." The cars moved. 20 minutes across the city, running lights, the streets gray and empty in the late hour, the water district and the commercial corridor and the residential blocks all sliding past in the dark. And Ronan sat in the back seat with his hands on his knees and felt his pulse in his throat and thought about a small white-haired woman in a room on the west side of the city who had no knowledge of the machinery that had put her at the center of 11 years of consequence, who had left an 8-year-old behind and had eventually lost the memory of doing it, who was now lying in a hospice bed while men with fake credentials stood at the entrance to her building because her son had made decisions this week that disrupted the financial calculations of men who had never met her and would not have been able to pick her out of a room. He was 6 minutes away. Torres's man was at the entrance. And somewhere between here and there, Selle was moving with the specific, purposeful momentum of a man who had decided that the withdrawal of the Sunday motion was an acceptable loss, but that demonstrating capability, demonstrating that the reach extended all the way to the most protected and personal thing Ronan Voss had allowed himself to have, was a message worth delivering regardless of cost. The car accelerated. The city went dark around him. And in a memory care ward on the west side, in a room with a portable speaker on the windowsill, a woman named Evelyn Hale shifted in her sleep, unaware and undefended, while the son she had left 33 years ago came through the dark at Peshawar. The car stopped hard outside Cedarfield's front entrance, and Ronan was out before it fully stopped moving. Torres's man, a compact, quiet operative named Fitch, who Ronan had never spoken to directly before tonight, was at the side entrance where the February dark pooled deep between the building and the neighboring fence line. He had his phone in his hand and his body positioned between the entrance and the street in the practiced way of someone who had been waiting for backup and was relieved it had arrived. "Where?" Ronan said. "They circled to the rear service access," Fitch said. "Parking structure. About 4 minutes ago. 2 men. I couldn't leave the entrance. Ronan looked at Dex. Dex was already moving toward the corner of the building. Torres peeled left without instruction. The two additional men from the second car spread wide in the dark. Ronan went through the side entrance. The corridor was empty, the padded quiet of the memory care ward unchanged. The low, warm light, the thick carpet, the photographs of landscapes on the walls. The night nurse's station was visible at the far end. Paulette was not at the desk. He felt that absence like a drop temperature, and he moved faster, not running, not yet, but the pace of a man who had done the arithmetic on time and distance and found the margin insufficient. He heard it before he reached room 14. Not violence, not of the sound of something breaking or someone hurting. A voice, low and professional and wrong in this corridor, wrong in this ward. The voice of a man who was somewhere he was not supposed to be and knew it and was past the point of caring. He came through the doorway. Two men. One was Celi, standing at the foot of the bed, coat on, hands at his sides, looking at the sleeping figure with the particular blankness of a man executing an instruction he had not emotionally engaged with. The second man Ronan didn't know, younger, thick through the shoulders, positioned near the window. Paulette was in the corner. She was standing against the wall with her arms crossed and her face set in the rigid composure of someone who was very frightened and was containing it by sheer will. She had not been touched. She had been moved out of the way, which was its own kind of statement. Evelyn was in the bed, awake. She had pushed herself partially upright, the instinct of a disturbed sleeper finding a threat without understanding it, and she was looking at the men in her room with the unfocused confusion of someone who had been pulled from sleep into a reality she couldn't map. Her hands were on the blanket. Her white hair was loose around her face. She looked small and bewildered and entirely without protection. Celi turned when Ronan came through the door. His face did not register surprise. He had expected this, had factored it into whatever calculation had brought him here anyway, which meant this was not about achieving the original objective. Reeve had pulled back. The Sunday motion was dead. Cel had come here knowing that and had come anyway, which meant this was now a message, a demonstration, a proof that the reach existed even after the hand that controlled it had been told to stand down. "You got here fast," Cel said. Ronan looked at him. He looked at the bed. He looked at Evelyn, who was looking at him now with the confused attention of someone trying to locate a face in a catalog that kept shuffling. "Step away from the bed," Ronan said. Cel didn't move. Reeve made his calls. "I heard them. That's his choice." He paused. "I'm here on my own judgment." "That's the wrong judgment." "Maybe, but here we are." He glanced at the bed, at the old woman sitting in the tangled sheets, and something in his expression shifted. Not softening, nothing that soft, but a recalibration. "She doesn't know what's happening. She won't remember this tomorrow. I want you to understand that I'm not here to hurt her." "Then why are you here?" "Because you need to understand," Cel said, "that what happened this week, the Meridian suspension, the Galvin files, Reeve standing down, none of that closes the account. You disrupted the organizational structure. You made personal decisions that created operational exposure. And then you walked into Reeve's office and used your name to walk out clean." His voice stayed even, professional. The voice of a man who believed he was being reasonable. Someone needed to demonstrate that clean isn't the same as finished. Ronan looked at him for a moment. He thought about the drive across the city, about Evelyn in the bed behind Celi, confused and frightened and trying to locate something recognizable in a room full of strangers at midnight. He thought about 33 years and the folder on the diner table, and Mila's voice saying she just kept showing up because stopping felt worse. He thought about what it had cost to get here. Not tonight, all of it. The whole compressed, brutal week of it. The decision to look, to follow the thread, to dismantle the machine that had broken a woman's arm in service of a debt she'd taken on to care for the mother he'd spent decades deciding not to look for. Every decision that had led from that booth in the diner to this room at midnight. He was not going to let it end with Cel standing at the foot of his mother's bed, making points about organizational accountability. He crossed the room. Cel moved to intercept and Ronan hit him. Not a managed tactical strike, not the calibrated application of force that operational training produced,
but the raw physical expression of everything that had been building since the moment he'd seen Mila's bruised jaw across a diner counter 3 weeks ago. His fist connected with Sele's jaw, and the impact traveled up his arm to his shoulder, and Sele went back into the window frame hard, the glass shuddering in its housing, and Ronan followed without pause. The second man came off the wall. Torres was through the door. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not elegant. It was close and physical and brutal in the way that real violence was brutal. Not cinematic, not choreographed, but the ugly geometry of bodies in a small space, the specific sounds of impacts and effort and pain, the metallic taste of exertion, the way the furniture became a factor, the chair catching someone's knee, the corner of the dresser finding a hip. Torres handled the second man with the efficient economy of someone who had been doing this work for a long time and had learned to remove variables quickly. Sel was on his feet. He was bleeding from his lip, and his eyes were clear, and he was still standing, which said something about him that Ronan acknowledged even as he grabbed him by the collar and drove him backward toward the door. "You're done," Ronan said. His voice had no performance in it, no volume, no heat, just the flatly certain register of a man communicating a fact. "You're done in this organization, you're done in this city, and if I see your face in any district, any operation, any building connected to anything I'm involved with after tonight, I will end your ability to be present anywhere." Sele looked at him. His jaw was swelling and his breathing was sharp, and he held Ronan's gaze for a moment with the stubborn dignity of a man who had lost and was not going to make it worse by pretending he hadn't. "This isn't over for you," Sel said, "even if it's over with me." "I know," Ronan said. He pushed him into the corridor. Dex was there. He took Sel. The second man was in Torres's hands, conscious and cooperative, in the way that people became cooperative when the alternative had been demonstrated. They left. The corridor was quiet again. Ronan stood in the doorway of room 14. Paulette had moved from the wall to the bedside. She was speaking to Evelyn in a low, steady voice, the practiced calm of someone returning a frightened patient to the ordinary, smoothing the blanket, checking the pulse with 2 fingers at the wrist, keeping her body between the bed and the door in the residual protective instinct of her profession. Evelyn was looking at the doorway, at him. She was looking at him with the uncertain focus of a woman trying to place something she couldn't quite locate. Not recognition, not the clean arrival of a face from memory, but something adjacent to it. The way you looked at a word on the tip of your tongue. The sense of proximity to something known. He came into the room. He sat in the chair. Paulette looked at him. He looked at her. Something passed between them that wasn't words. "I'll be at the station," she said. She left. He sat in the chair beside his mother's bed and looked at her, and she looked at him, and the room was very quiet. "You were here before," she said. Her voice was thin and slightly roughed from sleep, but present. The accent he remembered, the particular flat vowels of a town 400 miles north that he had spent years trying to locate in his own speech and excise. "Yes," he said. "I thought I dreamed it." "No." She looked at him. The confusion was still there. The flickering uncertainty of a mind that had lost most of its reliable architecture, but underneath it, something was working. Something was trying. "You look like someone," she said. He said nothing. "Someone I knew." She frowned. It cost her effort, the frowning. He could see the concentration required, the reaching. "A boy." His throat closed. He sat there and let it close and breathed through it the way he had breathed through everything in the last week, by simply continuing, by placing one breath after the other and not requiring the feeling to resolve itself on any particular schedule. "What's your name?" she said. He looked at her. "Ronan," he said. She said it after him, not an echo but a test, the word moving through some internal process of evaluation. Her eyes went somewhere else for a moment, somewhere internal, and then came back. "That was his name," she said. "My son." He put his hands flat on his knees. "I know," he said. She looked at him for a long time. The look had no clean category. It wasn't recognition, wasn't ignorance, wasn't the full arrival of a truth. It was something in the space between all of those, something that the dementia had stripped of its context but not entirely of its weight. "I left him," she said. It was not an explanation. It was not an apology. It was the plain statement of a woman who had arrived in the fog of her diminishment, at the bare fact of a thing she had done and could not undo, and had, apparently, been returning to for a long time. I left, and I didn't go back. I know, he said again. I wanted to, she said. I want you to know that. I wanted to go back. He looked at her, at the thin hands on the blanket, at the face that held the structure of something he had memorized before he was old enough to know he was memorizing it. Why didn't you? He said. Not accusation, just the question. The 8-year-old's question that had been sitting at the base of 33 years of construction and had never been answered. She looked at the window for a moment. I thought he was better without me, she said. I thought the thing I was would damage him. She paused. I was wrong. I know I was wrong, but I thought it at the time, and then too much time passed and I didn't know how to come back. She looked at him. I didn't know how to come back. He sat there. He sat there and felt the full weight of it, the specific grief of a thing that could not be fixed, that had produced its damage across decades, and could not be undone by an explanation, however honest, however late. It was not enough. It would never be enough in the transactional sense. The accounting would never balance. The wound would always have existed. The boy in the empty kitchen would always have waited. And it was what there was. It was the only thing that existed on the other side of 33 years of walls. Okay, he said. She looked at him. Something in her face shifted. A small, exhausted release. Like a thing she had been carrying had been acknowledged, which was not the same as being forgiven, but was something. Was real. Will you stay? She said. For a little while. Yes, he said. He stayed. Petit. Mila was at the safe house Torres had arranged when he got back at 4 a.m. It was a clean apartment in a neutral neighborhood, nothing identifying, good locks, a kitchen that had been stocked with the basics. She was awake, sitting at the table with a cup of tea going cold in front of her, still in the clothes she'd packed at her apartment, and she looked at him when he came through the door with the particular attention of someone who had been running probability calculations for several hours and was now reading the result in his face. Sele? She said. Handled. And she's fine. Mila breathed out. She set her hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. Then she looked up. Are you? She said. He sat down across from her. He thought about what to say and couldn't find the operational language for it because the operational language didn't fit this. He thought about Evelyn's face in the low light of room 14. He thought about the word okay and what it had meant when he said it and what it had cost and what it had given back. She was awake, he said. She talked to me. Mila was very still. She said she wanted to come back, he said. She said she didn't know how. Did you believe her? He thought about it honestly. He looked at the question from multiple angles, the way he looked at everything, and found that at the end of the examination, the answer was not simple and did not need to be. I believe she thought it was true, he said. I don't know if it was enough. I don't know if it changes anything. He paused. I don't know if it needs to. Mila looked at him, the clear, steady brown eyes that saw more than they let on. What does that mean? She said. It means I sat with her for an hour, and I let it be what it was, he said. Not what I needed it to be. Not what would have made it right. What it actually was. He looked at the table. An old woman who made a choice that destroyed something and couldn't fix it, and has been losing the memory of it. He paused. And a man who built 30 years of his life on the damage. She said nothing. I'm not the same person I was 3 weeks ago, he said. I don't know exactly what that means yet. I know the organization is going to have to change. I know the way I've been running it, the Meridian model, the Kessler operations, the entire framework of feeding on the people who have nothing. I can't go back to that. Not because it's strategically untenable, though it is, but because I know what it does now. I've seen it in a woman's broken arm and in a $52,000 loan taken out in a diner neighborhood to keep a stranger alive. He looked at her. I can't unknow that. Mila was quiet for a moment. The organization doesn't disappear, she said. Not a question. An understanding of the real. No, he said. It doesn't disappear. It's still dangerous and it's still what it is.
But what it feeds on changes. That's in my control. What I build it on top of is in my control. She looked at him steadily. Is that enough for you? It was a serious question, and he treated it as one.
I don't know yet, he said. But it's what's true right now, and I'm going to work with what's true. She nodded. She picked up her tea, found it cold, set it back down. You should sleep, she said. So should you. I've been trying. A dry note entered her voice, brief and human. It hasn't been a cooperative effort. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely a shift in the set of his face, but it was real. 3 weeks later, the city was doing what cities did in the first days of spring. Hesitant and unconvinced, the cold still present in the shadows, but the light arriving earlier and staying longer, finding its way into places that had been gray since November. The construction sites were active again. The park trees were producing the first tentative green of budding leaves. People walked differently, slightly less defended, the winter posture of hunched shoulders and lowered heads beginning to ease. Mila's cast came off on a Tuesday. She stood in the clinic hallway and turned her right arm over and looked at it. Thinner than the left, the skin pale where the plaster had been, the muscle atrophied from 12 weeks of immobility, and flexed her fingers slowly and felt the specific fragile newness of a thing that had healed but was not yet what it had been. That afternoon she went to Cedarfield. Evelyn was having a good day. They happen less frequently now, the good days. The ones where the fog lifted enough for real presence and real exchange. But they still happened, and this was one of them. She was sitting in the chair by the window when Mila came in, and she turned and her face arranged itself into the particular expression it made for Mila, the one that combined recognition with something that went beyond recognition. The face you made for someone who had shown up consistently enough to become part of the permanent landscape of your diminished world. Your arm, Evelyn said. She reached out and touched the wrist gently. All healed, Mila said. Good. She held the wrist for a moment. Her eyes went to the door. Is he coming? Later, Mila said. He said he'd come tonight. Evelyn nodded. She turned back to the window. Outside, the sky was doing something with the late afternoon light that fell just short of beautiful, gray and gold at the same time, the particular palette of early spring in this city. He came 3 times this week, Evelyn said. Not pride, not exactly. More the simple documentation of a fact that mattered. He sits with me. He doesn't talk much, but he sits. That sounds about right, Mila said. Evelyn made a sound that might have been a laugh in another register. He has his father's way of being quiet. She paused. His father was a quiet man too, quiet and hard. Ronan got the quiet, but not all the hard. She tilted her head. Or maybe he got a different kind of hard. I don't know. I don't know him well enough yet. The word yet was quiet and real and carried in it the awareness of how little time remained for the knowing. Mila set the speaker on the windowsill and turned it on. Something slow and instrumental, the kind of music that didn't ask anything of you. They sat together in the good light. Ronan came at 8. He came through the side entrance, nodded at Paulette, walked the corridor he now knew by feel. The particular placement of the light fixtures, the way the third room on the left had a door that didn't fully close, the sound the floor made near the nurse's station. He had been coming often enough that it had become a known geography, a place he was learning to inhabit. Mila was in the hallway when he arrived. She had her coat on and her canvas bag over her shoulder and her right arm free of the cast, and she looked in the specific way she sometimes looked when caught in an unguarded moment, like exactly what she was. A tired, unsentimental, completely ordinary person who had done an extraordinary thing by accident and was still trying to understand the shape of it. They stood in the corridor for a moment. She's awake, Mila said. Good day. How long? An hour, maybe? Hard to say. He looked at the door to room 14, the slightly warm light underneath it, the sound of something slow and instrumental coming from the portable speaker on the windowsill. I brought something, he said. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a photograph. Old, the edges soft with handling. The colors faded to the particular warmth of images from before everything went digital. It showed a woman in a yard somewhere, laughing at something off camera, her hair loose and longer than it was now,
her face younger and unguarded and caught in the unself-conscious happiness of a moment that had not yet become a memory. He had found it in a box in his father's storage unit, a box he had not opened in 20 years, that he had carried from apartment to apartment and building to building without ever looking inside, because looking inside was the one thing he had not been ready to do. He had opened it last week. Mila looked at the photograph. She looked at him. "She'll like that," she said quietly. He put it back in his pocket. He looked at the door for another moment, not hesitating, not stalling, just pausing at the threshold the way you paused at things that mattered to acknowledge that they mattered, to give them the weight they deserved before you walked through. Then he walked through. Evelyn turned, and her face did the thing it sometimes did on good days, the uncertain reaching, the sense of proximity to something known, the flickering arrival of a recognition that was never quite complete, but was never entirely absent either. She looked at him the way she had looked at him 3 weeks ago on the night the men had come, the night the ward had been wrong and frightened, the night he had sat in the chair beside her and said, "Okay." "You came," she said. "I said I would," he said. He sat in the chair. He reached into his coat and took out the photograph and held it out to her. She took it. She held it close and looked at it for a long moment. Something moved through her face, not pain, not the sharp edge of grief that a mind fully present would bring to a photograph from a life now mostly gone. Something softer and less precise, the warmth of a thing recognized from a great distance. "I was happy that day," she said. "I know," he said. "I remember." She looked at him. He held her gaze. Outside, the city went about its business, the lights coming on as the last of the day's light bled out of the sky, the streets filling with the ordinary human traffic of a Tuesday evening, people moving between the places they needed to be, carrying what they carried, living inside the 1,000 private stories that a city held without knowing it held them. The music played. The room was warm. Evelyn looked at the photograph in her hands, and then looked at the window, and then looked at the man in the chair who had his father's quiet and a different kind of hard and had been coming every week to sit with her. And she said, with the specific simple clarity that arrived sometimes in the good hours, "I'm glad you found me." He breathed, in and out. "So am I," he said. It was not a resolution in the clean sense. It did not restore what had been taken. It did not rebuild the 8 years that had preceded the kitchen and the absence, or the 33 that had come after. It did not redeem the men whose bones had been broken, or the women whose arms had been shattered, or the 162 people in 64 Meridian accounts whose debts had been structured to be inescapable. He had discharged all of them, quietly, through the corporate architecture Corau had built, and each discharge was a real thing, and none of them was sufficient. None of it was sufficient. It was what there was. He understood, sitting in the chair in room 14 with the music playing and the city going about its indifferent business outside, that this was the actual texture of the thing. Not the dramatic break, not the moment of transformation that cinema promised and life rarely delivered, but the slow, grinding, repeated choice to keep showing up, to keep sitting in the chair, to keep coming through the door. When coming through the door cost something. The empire remained. It was still dangerous. It still moved money and applied pressure and existed in the spaces where legal and illegal blurred into the functional reality of a city that needed people willing to operate in the gray. That was not going to change. He was not a different species than the man he had been a month ago. But the machine would not feed on the desperate anymore. That was a real thing. That was a line drawn in a place that hadn't had a line before, and he would hold it, at whatever cost the holding required, because he had seen what it produced when there was no line, and he could not unsee it. Evelyn's eyes were closing. The good hours always ended in sleep. The effort of presence was exhausting in a way that rest was the only resolution for. Her head dropped slightly toward her shoulder, and her breathing changed, and the photograph remained in her hands, held loosely now, her fingers relaxed around it. Ronan reached over and gently took the photograph from her hands before it could fall. He looked at it for a moment. His mother's face, young and laughing, caught in a moment from before everything that came after. He put it back in his coat pocket. He sat for a while longer in the quiet room with the music playing and the light from the window making the particular late evening pattern on the floor that he had learned to recognize over the last 3 weeks, And he thought about nothing specific, which was unusual for him. Not the organization, not Reeves' ongoing demotion, not Corral in his supervised apartment, not the Galvin situation which Dex was addressing through channels that would take months and require patience. Not Celia, who had left the city and whose absence Ronan monitored the way you monitored a removed variable, aware it could return, not spending energy on the anticipation. He thought about the diner, about 2 a.m, twice a week, and the particular amber light of the place, and the sound of the grill, and a woman with tired eyes who brought coffee without being asked, and said, "You look like you haven't eaten anything real in days." He stood up. He pulled on his coat. He looked at Evelyn, small and still, and breathing slow in the hospital bed, the photograph somewhere in his pocket, the music still playing on the speaker she'd brought, the light laying gently across everything. He walked out. In the corridor, Mila was leaning against the wall, waiting, because she had somewhere else she needed to be and had stayed anyway. They walked out of the building together into the spring evening, and the air was cold but not cruel, and the city was doing what it did, indifferent and continuous and full of the 1,000 ordinary transactions of people trying to get through to the next day. He didn't say anything for half a block. Then he said, "She fell asleep with the photograph." Mila looked at him. "Good," she said. They walked. The city moved around them, and somewhere behind them, in a room on the west side, a woman named Evelyn Hale slept in the light of a spring evening with music playing, tended and not alone, which was not everything and was not nothing, and was, in the end, the most honest thing that could be said about any of it.